Hey readers, it's Mr. Marshall at Stony Lane. So I know that you and your teachers have been working on reading a book called a type of book called historical fiction. Historical fiction is the kind of a story that didn't really happen, but it's set in a time that really happened, and there might actually be real people that really existed that are in your story, but most of your story is about people that didn't really exist. Okay, and when you're reading historical fiction, something that's bigger than maybe in other books that you've read is the setting. That's the where and the when the story happened. So when we're reading historical fiction, then we want to be thinking about, well, what do we know about the time period? What do we know about the place where the story happened? So we're going to read a book together. And while we're reading the book, we're going to do some of that work. And the book we're going to read is going to be from a place that, or from a time period that you may or may not know a lot about, but we're going to do some thinking about that together. Okay, are you ready? So this is a story called Lewis and Papa. It's a picture book, and historical fiction is in chapter books and it's in picture books. Okay, this is a book that's written by Barbara Usay, who writes lots of really awesome picture books. If you ever have a chance to read her books, they're really good. Okay, so this is called Papa and Me. I mean, no, Lewis and Papa. Sorry. And in here, as you know, in the beginning of a picture book, there's always end paper right here, and sometimes the end paper helps to tell the story. Okay, and sometimes it's just art, but this really helps to set the setting. So this says it's the Santa Fe Trail from 1821 to 1880. So it shows this is like the Great Plains, which is the middle of the United States. Here's the northern part of Texas. Here's Colorado and New Mexico. And there's some mountains here. Okay, so what you need to know here is that, oh, here's the Missouri River, which is one of the longest rivers in the United States. And then there's some other rivers, the Arkansas River, the Cimarron River. So what you need to know about this time in the United States is those places, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, they weren't states yet, right? But they were territories. And so people were kind of going out and exploring those places and kind of settling them. They were trying to see what was out there, and sometimes that was dangerous, right? So let's take a look. I can see that on the inside cover here. See that those are covered wagons. Covered wagons are like they didn't have cars. They didn't have anything else to get them anywhere but these wagons, and so it took a long time because they were drawn by horses or by cattle, and so it took a long time to get anywhere. Okay, and that was dangerous, especially when it was winter, right? Or if they were in a place where there were wild animals, right? So there's a lot of danger going on in this story. So that's what we think about in the beginning of historical fiction. We try to think about the setting and what we know, and we think, how does the setting affect the characters? So let's keep going. Let's start our book. Look at this beautiful picture. Besides the fact that it's beautiful, it helps us to learn about the story. Ready? Can you see that? It says, Lewis lived in a sturdy stone house on the Wisconsin River. One day, a traveler happened by, and Papa invited him to spend the night. After stew and cornbread, the travelers spun stories about the Santa Fe Trail. Santa Fe is the capital of New Mexico now, but it's a big settlement in New Mexico. The trail is so long, you leave a boy and you come back a man, and hard. See this beard? He spread out his white beard. It was black as coal when I left, he said with a chuckle. But here's the truth. In Santa Fe, they'll pay a pretty penny for goods from the East. My advice is to pack a wagon. In Santa Fe, you'll make a fortune. So it looks like we're learning something about that, right? Because people are bringing things in from the East and selling them because there aren't lots of stores or anything out there in the West yet. After the man was asleep, let me go on this side, it's easier to read. After the man was asleep, Mama and Papa talked into the night. Louis and Susanna listened from the loft. Come spring, Papa would take the Santa Fe Trail. He'd take his favorite ox, Big Red, to pull the wagon. He'd take Louis to help along the way. It felt real nice that Papa wanted to take him. It made Louis feel grown up. All right, so let's keep going. When spring broke the ice, take a look at that. Such a different picture, right? You could tell the seasons have changed. When spring broke the ice and apple trees filled with blossoms, Papa and Louis were packed to leave. Susanna handed Louis her lucky rock, the one smoothed by the river. Mama tucked some ginger snaps into Louis's pocket and neatened his hair with her hand. Louis would really miss Mama. He'd miss Susanna, too, and the river, and the apples. Louis's eyes filled with tears, but he hid his face so no one would see. So this part of the story kind of makes me feel sad because it sounds like their family is going to be separated, right? Because in those days, families needed to, if they traveled, like it just took so long that now they wouldn't be together, right? Independence, Missouri was the gateway to the West. Boots, wheels, and hooves churned streets into mud. Cussing and gunfire crackled in the air. Papa and Big Red weren't afraid, but Louis was. When it was time to load the wagon, Papa just knew just how. Heavy things on the bottom, he said, lifting the kegs of nails. Louis wondered if his muscles would ever bulge like Papa's. Dry things at the top. Louis scampered up with the calico and stuffed it into little crevices so the cloth would stay dry when they crossed the rivers. Why, Louis, Papa said, you're as nimble as a cat. Look at that. It sounds like this kid Louis is going through some challenges that maybe we wouldn't need to go through here, right? In the 21st century, in where we live, right? Because it's just different, right? The wagon groaned across the prairie. At night, Papa unhitched Big Red and the other oxen, right? Big Red is an ox. He gave extra water to Big Red because he was his favorite. Look at that. Can you imagine being there, maybe with your dad, with an ox and a bunch of oxen that are yours? The stars swept up in a great wide arc. It made Louis feel so small he thought he might disappear. In Council Grove, they would hook up with the rest of the wagon train. How long would it take to get to Santa Fe? Would they see Native Americans? Would they be friendly? Would there be wild animals? A coyote howled, and Louis shivered. I never did like the sound of coyotes, said Papa, but I feel right brave next to you, Louis. Wow, that's a whole different kind of brave than we have to be, right? Coyotes. At Council Grove, Louis's stomach flip-flopped with excitement. When 60 men and 40 wagons were in place, the wagon master blew his bugle. Stretch out, he cried. And they did. 40 prairie schooners headed for Santa Fe. Ahead lay more and more and more prairie. Papa was handy with a whip as he flicked the oxen into place. He never flicked Big Red, though. He seemed to know what Papa wanted, and Papa rewarded him with pats on the flank. Dark clouds of grasshoppers swelled before the oxen. Look at that. And great choking clouds of dust rose behind them. Louis coughed from the dust. Do you miss Mama? Louis asked. Surely do, Papa said, tying his kerchief across Louis's mouth so the dust couldn't get in. So, why are they making this big trip? They're going there because they need to sell stuff from the East and bring that money back home. But that means that they're going to be away for a long, long time. Wow. It's kind of hard, isn't it? At night, the wagons formed a circle. Papa covered Louis with a buffalo robe and joined the other men around the campfire. Louis wanted to stay up as long as Papa, but Big Red's slow breathing made his eyes heavy. And soon he was asleep. Take a look at this picture. Ready? Look at this picture. Wow. Wow, that was what their night was like. Louis woke up to a terrible thunder that shook the sky and the ground and everything on the prairie. The noise made Louis's teeth chatter. Papa's eyes flew open. "Buffalo!" he cried, and the men drew their rifles, and Louis made himself uh, small under the wagon. Dust filled the sky until there was no blue. A shaggy brown thundering sea rolled in. The men began to shoot. The crack of their guns seemed small, but enough to stop the buffalo. When they came close, Papa stepped in front and shot. And the herd parted around the wagon train. The buffalo, were trampling, and they could have killed them, right? That night, everyone feasted on the running meat and told the story of Papa saving the wagon train. That means they ate the buffalo. When they were settled under the wagon, Louis said, "I was afraid when the buffalo came." "So was I," said Papa. "My legs shook like Mom's grape jelly." "But you stood in front anyway." "I did what needed to be done. There's no shame in feeling scared." There's no shame in feeling scared. Can you imagine that? His papa had to do that very hard thing, standing in front of the buffalo that were all trampling toward him, and then he shot his gun. There's no shame in being scared, right? That's one of the things that these people learned. There's no shame in being scared. At last the train reached the Arkansas River. There were steep banks and shifting sand. How would they get across? Wow, look at that. Look at this. Look at that picture. There's this wide river. They've gone all this way. And how are they going to cross it with those covered wagons? They can't go across a big river like that. So they need to figure it out, right? They can't just be like, "Oh, well, I'm going to turn around." They can't be like, "Oh, well, let me go on my phone and see where I can." No. They had to figure it out. They had to build a bridge. That makes me think that people in that time, well, they didn't have a cell phone that they could just like, boop, 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 boop. They didn't have any way that they could find the shortcut. They had to just figure it out. And so it looks like they're doing that. I guess people in that time needed to be a lot more creative in the way they figured out problems, right? The men cut down the bank with shovels. "I'll gather branches and shrubs," said Louis. "We can throw them in the water so the oxen won't slide in the sand." Louis gathered as many branches as he could. "Louis had a fine idea," one of the men said to Papa, "and he does a grown man's work." Papa's chest swelled with pride, and he winked at Louis. Then he filled the water bottles for the long, dry desert. The desert was hot. Wow. We don't have to deal with that, right? Like when it's hot, we just turn the air conditioner on, right? We just turn a fan on. They can do that. They didn't have those things, especially out in the middle of nowhere, right? The desert was hot. The only water they had was in the barrels. So Louis drank just a little, because if he drank too much, it would be gone. There's nowhere to get water. Each day, Big Red became slower. That's a problem, right? They must be worried about Big Red, because Big Red isn't a machine. Big Red's a living thing, right? And this heat is getting on him. Papa scraped his Papa scraped a little more water out of the barrel, and Big Red drank it eagerly. Still, he hung his head in the heat. Then one afternoon, the water ran out. Big Red's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. "Papa," pleaded Louis, "do something." This part's tough. Papa put his big, calloused hand on Louis's shoulder. "There's nothing more I can do," said Papa, "and I can't let him suffer." Papa patted Big Red lovingly and whispered something in his ear. He drew out his rifle, and Big Red raised his round eyes to him, and Papa shot him. Yeah, it's tough, right? But what we have to remember is that Big Red wasn't a pet. Big Red was an animal that was almost like a tool, right? And that's really hard. It's hard for us to think about that way, right? Um, but that's what they needed to do. They were in the middle of nowhere. They couldn't help Big Red. And that happens. No. Tears pushed at Lewis's eyes. He wanted Big Red back. He wanted Mama and her ginger snaps. But more than that, he wanted to be a man that Papa would be proud of. A man who didn't cry. So he pushed his tears inside. Papa wrapped his arms around Lewis. But Lewis brushed away. That's when he noticed something. So let's stop right there. It's tough, right? This is a really tough thing to read, even for me. Because nobody wants to hear about that an animal had to die and that Papa had to shoot him, right? It's really rough. But that's one thing that's true when we read historical fiction is sometimes we read things that are tough for us to read because we live in a different setting. We have different feelings and we have different ways that we see the world. And that can feel hard as a reader. And so when you're reading historical fiction, you might see something that's hard for you too. But it's part of the story. And we have to remember it's just a story anyway, right? But there's some things about it that are real. The way that these people are dealing with their feelings. These feelings are real, right? And think of all the things that Lewis is feeling right now. Lewis is feeling like he wants to be tough. He wants to be a man, right? He wants to grow up. He wants to prove to his father that he's tough and that he's ready. But he's still a little boy. And he still feels sad, right? This next part is going to be really surprising. Ready? He noticed something. Papa, you're crying, he whispered. There's no shame in tears, said Papa. Big Red and I have been together a long time. The shame would be in feeling nothing for such a good friend. Lewis put his arm around Papa's big shoulders. Papa needed him now. He patted Papa's calloused hand and cried with Papa until their tears were done. That's something that's true then. It's true now too. Sometimes our parents need us to be there for them when they're upset. Because if you're in a family, you do that for each other, don't you? Right? The Santa Fe Trail was long and hard, and in the end, Lewis and Papa made a pretty penny. But the best part? They took the trail together. Look at that beautiful picture. You know, when we read historical fiction, we think a lot about the setting. I told you that. But when we think about the setting, we think about how the setting is affecting the characters. We just saw how it affected them in one way with their feelings about Big Red. But it affected them in another way too. They made a pretty penny. But the best part, they took this trail together. They dreamed under the stars, and they were thirsty under the sun. They did what needed to be done, and they cried when it was right. And so it was that Papa taught Lewis to be a man, and Lewis taught Papa. And that was the real fortune. And that is the end. In the back here, this book gives information about what it was like to be on the Santa Fe Trail. This is information that's all true. This is nonfiction in the back of a historical fiction book. That can happen when you read historical fiction too. You can learn more by reading some of the more informational stuff at the end of the book. Okay, that's the end. And I know this book had some tough parts in it, but I think that helps us to learn about the setting that we're reading about in this historical fiction text. Okay, so when you're reading historical fiction, there's a lot of work that we just did that you can do in your book. Whatever setting you're reading about, you're going to think about how the setting, like what you know about the setting, you're going to think about how the setting is affecting the characters and how they're changing because of it, and how it's kind of like or kind of not like where and when we live right now. Okay? So, whatever you're reading, I hope that you do some really good work, and maybe you and your teacher can talk about this book while you're working on other books. And I hope you enjoy that and that you learn a whole lot as a reader. All right? I'll see you next time.